I was off duty. I was called in to investigate a car fire burning in the alley in the rear of 196 West Buena Vista.
It's the day after Thanksgiving, and most people are still at home, sleeping off their turkey dinner, as the firefighters quickly douse the flames.
In the process, the firefighters actually getting into the vehicle, they discovered the remains of a body.
Firefighters determine the victim is a woman.
Head down, feet up, wrapped in a comforter or something, a blanket. It was incredibly disturbing. The area the car was set in was an overgrown alley situated behind mostly vacant houses.
While there's no sign of any breakdown or accident, the interior of the car is littered with worrying signs.
Her head was down into the like center console, and she was squished in there. There's no way anybody would be riding like that. There was overwhelming evidence that it was an intentionally set fire.
Our experience tells us that usually when someone sets a fire, it's to destroy evidence, especially since the advent of DNA.
It was an ugly scene. It was obviously not a natural death, and it certainly wasn't an accidental death either. So it certainly pointed to homicide.
Approximately 40 feet away from the vehicle, there's this burnt blue bag. You're looking at it, you're like, well, did a hose line knock this down there? Was it in the vehicle? Anything could be potentially evidence.
As they gather what evidence they can, police officers attempt to identify the tragic victim.
Police officers ran the plate, and then we were able to see a medical identification bracelet on her wrist, identifying her as Helen Gale.
Helen Gale was an 81-year-old widower. She lived alone, and she had 2 daughters.
She was a pillar of the community, well-liked by everyone, living an active, very active life. She had worked for the Southfield Parks and Recreation Department for 31 years.
The next morning, I received a phone call from an old family friend, and she said, the police found a burning car that we think is your mom's, and her body is in the car.
After finding Helen Gale's name among the ashes, investigators head to her home to search the premises.
No one was home, and everything appeared initially to be relatively normal until a closer look.
There was no forced entry. The house was not ransacked either. In the bedroom, her flip phone is open, so she may have even tried to reach over and tried to call the police once she realized an intruder was in the house.
We determined that the crime occurred sometime in the evening after Nancy Gale spoke to her mother, and the next morning when the vehicle was discovered in the alley in Highland Park set ablaze.
Detectives look to forensic science to determine exactly how Helen Gale died.
The autopsy showed that there was no soot in her lungs or trachea, so there's no question she was dead before she was set on fire. She wasn't set on fire alive. The autopsy ruled that she died from strangulation, and that was her cause of death.
Several days after the homicide, a person by the name of Darren Keener, Helen's next-door neighbor, called the police department to report that a gas can was stolen off of his back porch. A Southfield investigator went down to the alley, and quite some distance from her car, there was a gas can in a pile of brush and trash and whatnot. There appeared to be a small amount of melted blue substance or fabric on the gas can itself.
The traces of melted bag on the gas can proved that the bag and the can were both at the crime scene when the fire was set.
We had no clear-cut direction. We had no suspects. It was a whodunit case. Helen Gale's actual case file was kept on my desk, and I never put it in a cabinet where it was out of sight, out of mind. But in 2016, I went back to being a patrol officer, became an evidence tech and training officer for the last few years of my career.
With Detective Palmer no longer in charge, the case of the murdered grandmother goes as cold as a Michigan snowstorm.
The case went cold. The first few times I heard that, I could not reconcile it. Finally, I was talking to my best friend, Rosie. I said, what can we do about this? And she's a writer, as it happens. And so she wrote a story of just how ridiculous it is that something that is front page, frontline news for so long just goes flat. As if, okay, they're over that. My mom doesn't matter. That's if you're not careful, that's how it can be taken. So she writes this story.
Nancy and Rosie plan to send the letter to the media to pressure the police to pick up the case. First, Nancy takes some advice from a new private investigator friend.
Scott was an investigative journalist, and now he's a private investigator, does a lot of innocence work. And he said, look, if we blast it to the media, it infuriates people, and you get a lot of noise. But is that really, what's our real objective? It's to get the police back on the case. So do we want to make them angry? Or do we want to say, look, we need something to be done, and we want to work with you?
Scott sends the letter to his contacts at local police departments, including the cold case unit at the sheriff's office in Oakland County.
I was actually getting my hair done, and the next thing I know, I get a phone call from a sergeant at Oakland County, and he said, your mom's paperwork is on my desk, and we're going to start giving some real attention to the case. And there we were, like back in action.
We saw that Southfield had talked to Darren Keener, a neighbor of Helen. Darren Keener had an alibi. The murder happened on the Friday night, Saturday morning of the Thanksgiving weekend. Keener's alibi was that he had his daughter that weekend. He had been divorced from his ex-wife, and he had, I believe, one weekend a month where she could stay with him. And he told Southfield that that was his weekend. We talked with his ex-wife about visitation weekends when he had his daughter. And she responded immediately, oh, I have a journal. I have a journal going all the way back. So yes, I can tell you when his weekends were. Really? Could we see it?
The records show that he didn't have her that weekend. His alibi is verifiably false.
The cold case team takes a closer look at Keener's cell phone records.
One of the things we found was that he made some calls to a part-time girlfriend whom he had met, as I recall, in rehab, and told her that morning after the crime had happened that he had done something bad, something very bad. She didn't know what it was about, but he was definitely upset and possibly remorseful after the killing happened. I was convinced, way beyond a reasonable doubt, that Keener was our guy, that he had attacked and killed Helen Gale in her bedroom, had put her in the car, taken her car with the body in it to Highland Park, and torched it in an attempt to separate it from the initial crime scene. That's when we arrested him and put him in front of the court.
Facing overwhelming evidence against him, Keener strikes a plea deal, just as cold case detectives had hoped.
He was charged with murder and subsequently pled guilty to second-degree murder.
He never confessed what he did. He pled guilty, but he never explained his actions. He was sentenced to 12 to 50 years in prison. And so overall, I'm satisfied, especially if it's closer to 50.
Something snapped for this man, and that makes me sad. And it feels better to feel sad for him. And it's really a nod to my mom. She taught me to be resilient, and she taught me about redemption. And that is my mom's legacy.